Thanks, PG. Good morning. Everybody's awake this morning. That's good. So as PG said, it's back to school season, right? And I am glad that we get to have Kids of Summer Experience, aka VBS, right before the kids go back. Because I think, as PG mentioned, they have a lot of challenges when they go back to school. Learning is one, as you mentioned, PG, but they're going back to a different environment, right? They're going back to a very worldly environment. And I think the summer experience gives them a chance to get to know the Lord better, maybe get to know the Lord for the first time when they come here for that. And as Amaryllis mentioned, there were a lot of kids who came to the Lord for the first time, right? Mio and I hosted two of my little nephews over the week last week. They're not churched, but they enjoyed it. They were here, they were having fun, and at the end of the week, they came forward. So for us, that was a blessing. And now, as Amaryllis mentioned, we had a lot of kids. We had more than 50 kids here over the 5 days of during the week. We had more than 20 volunteers. So I'd like to take a minute. If you were a volunteer at Kids of Summer Experience last week, would you please stand up? Nancy, I know you were here. Yep. Can we give them a hand? Now, some of the volunteers who were here also work at the academy. So there were people who were here from 6 a.m. until 9 p.m. all day, every day last week, right? There was a lot of work that went into preparations. There was a lot of work that went into scheduling and his organization. And I wanted to give a special thanks to Amaryllis for coordinating, organizing, and running Kids Zone over the past week. And I knew quite a few weeks ago that I was going to have to give the message to wrap up that week. And, you know, I was thinking that I should be doing something back to school related. But while I was here serving last week, I was praying about it, and I felt the Holy Spirit telling me that we needed to look at something that ties into that type of ministry, but in a different way. So I felt the Lord was telling me that we need to take a look at the book of Nehemiah today, right? Old Testament stuff. Some people don't read it a lot. I'm not going to sit here and read it to you. That would be boring. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to paraphrase for you chapters 1 through 6 of the book of Nehemiah. Okay, so bear with me. But I would encourage you, after you go home, to read those 6 chapters yourself. Whatever translation you like, but read them for yourself. Okay? But to give you a little bit of background of what's happening and leading up to the book of Nehemiah. Right? So you all know that the Jewish people settled in Israel. Right? They went through a long period of following God, not following God, following God, not following God. And basically they weren't following God enough. And that culminated in Israel being attacked by Babylon. Babylon was the superpower of the day in that region of the world. So Babylon comes in, they conquer Israel. They take over everything. Right? They destroy the capital city of Jerusalem. They destroy the walls that protect the city from animals, from attackers, from everything. They destroy the walls. They destroy the temple. The temple of God in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians. And the remaining stones from the wall and the temple are scattered around into piles to prevent them from rebuilding easily. And the Babylonians also burned all of the timbers that were used to construct the gates and the reinforcements in the wall and the temple itself. So all of the timbers were burned. And as you know from living in a house, the timbers are important, right? That's what holds up the structure. So everything was destroyed. It was left as a wasteland by the Babylonian conquerors. Now, all of this happened a little over 2,604 years ago. Well, that's a little too accurate, but so that's roughly 590 years before Christ, to put that into historical perspective, right? So Babylon comes in, they destroy everything, and they take the Jewish people and they move them to Babylon. right? They're removed from their country and they're taken to this other country, and they live there for 50 years, right? You'll hear 70 years sometimes, but 70 years was till the reestablishment of the temple in Jerusalem. But 50 years from the time that Jerusalem was destroyed, they had to live in another country under another power. They had to bow to another king, right? We know the story about Daniel not bowing. We know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's all happening while they're in exile, right? But after 50 years or so, something happens. Another superpower emerges. Persia comes on the scene. And Persia comes in and they attack and take over Babylon. And the Persian king has a different attitude towards the Jewish people. The Persian king allows the Jewish people to start moving back to Israel, to start moving back to their homeland. And that's where we pick up the story. That's where Nehemiah starts writing his book. So some of the Jewish people have moved back to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah writes this book from his own first-person perspective, right? He's talking about himself and his experiences, right? And he's living in the capital city of the Persian Empire. And he has a very important position. He is the cupbearer for the king. Now, to us, that sounds like not really a very important job, right? It sounds like a waiter. You bring the guy his cup, and you take his cup away, right? But at that time, it was a very important position because you were one of the last people who were in line to protect the king, right? In ancient times, one of the best ways to assassinate somebody was to have poison slipped into their food or their drink. So Nehemiah's job was to make sure the king didn't get poisoned. Now think about this. He's somebody from a foreign country, basically. He's a captive. And the king trusts him enough that he protects him, right? So Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. And he also has a brother. Nehemiah's brother is named Hanani. Okay? So Hanani comes to visit Nehemiah. And Nehemiah asked him how those Jewish people that went back to Jerusalem and to Israel were doing. And Hanani explains that they're in deep trouble because they've gone back, but there's nothing there. The city's been destroyed. It's been leveled, right? If you've seen any of those recent disaster movies, there's nothing left. It's just like that. There's no houses. There's no wall to protect the people. They're at the mercy of, bandits, the surrounding people who moved in and took over the land after the Israelites were taken away. So they're unprotected. Right? And this really touches Nehemiah. It's his people who are living back there and they're in danger. And he starts weeping and he mourns. And then he fasts and he prays. And he prays for days. Right? And then he asks God to listen to his words. He asks God to listen to what he's praying for. And he realizes that the reason that they are there is because they had not been following God's rules for so long. Right? And he repents for his nation. He repents for his people. He says, God, I am sorry we failed to obey you. Right? And he admits that God had told them when he gave the law to Moses that that was what would happen, that they would be placed into exile if they didn't obey. Right? So God tells this to him. And Nehemiah asks God if he can help out. He asks God for success and mercy because he's going to undertake a mission. He's going to do something important. Right? And that's where book 1 leaves off. Okay? Book 2 starts with Nehemiah doing his job. He's going and he's serving the king. And the king notices something unusual about Nehemiah on this day. He noticed that he looks downcast. He is sad. He is grieved. And the king has never seen him this way. And the king, to show you how important Nehemiah is, takes notice and asks him what the problem is. And Nehemiah explains the situation of his people and explains that their homeland is devastated and is a wasteland, even though they're moving back. And then the king says, well, do you have a request of me? And so Nehemiah prays to God, and then he says to the king, I would like to go back to my homeland and help to rebuild the city of my people. And the king says, okay, how long will you be gone? That's a lot of favor, right? I mean, the king, the guy that you serve says, okay, you can go do that, right? How much time do you need? So the king agrees, and they set a date for when Nehemiah will leave and when he will return. So God's also working in Nehemiah's life through the king, right? Normally, that's not something you'd permit your servant to do, right? But he's letting him go back and rebuild his country. Nehemiah also has a second request. He knows that it's going to be difficult to get from where he is to Jerusalem safely, right? And he knows that there's going to be challenges along the way. The people who are there now, they don't want the Israelites coming back, right? They've settled in, right? The people on the way have settled in. So Nehemiah asks the king for letters to safeguard his passage, right? And he also asks the king to give him a contact. So the contact is the chief forester for the king. So the guy who's in charge of all the forests in the kingdom, he's responsible for providing proper timber, proper wood for construction. So he asks for a contact with that person as well. Enemy. He gets there and he stays there for 3 days. Doesn't do anything yet, right? And then at night, after the third day, he goes out with a few select men and he surveys the area. Right? He doesn't want anybody who's there to know what he's doing, right? Because sometimes if people know what you're doing, if they're already dug in, they don't really want any change, right? They like things the way they are. So he goes out on the sly. He goes out quietly by himself with these other couple, not really by himself, but with these other couple guys, and they scope things out. They see how bad the damage is to the walls. They see what places need to be rebuilt. And then, after he's figured out where everything needs to be fixed, he goes and he addresses the people of Jerusalem. And he urges them to rebuild the wall to protect themselves in the city. And he explains how both God and the king have been gracious to him, right? So he's blessed, and he's showing them that they will be blessed if they do this. So what do the people do? They're on board. They want to rebuild the wall, right? They want to be protected. Now, those two enemies we talked about before, they're on the scene still, right? And they start accusing the people of being rebellious towards the king of Babylon, right? They know that they're not being because they've got the looks like a shopping list, right? where there's this guy had this many followers, this many descendants, this guy had this many descendants. It looks like a laundry list, right? At first glance, Nehemiah book 3 looks like that, right? It says this guy built this section of the wall. This guy built this section of the wall. But I'd like you to, when you reread this, reread book 3 carefully, because I think this is the core of what I was being told to talk about today. So I'm going to give you a little summary of this one as well. So again, it's not just another long list or a record-keeping chapter. There's a lot of those in the Old Testament too. But there's important info that's in here. And Nehemiah is very specific with some of the information that he gives out. So first, he explains exactly who repaired and rebuilt the sections of the wall, right? And the gates. The gates are important. So groups of people from specific areas worked on sections of the wall, right? If your family was from this area of Israel or this area of Jerusalem, you worked on this section together with the people from your area, right? There were people who rebuilt sections of the wall as a family, right? There were people who rebuilt sections of the wall as individuals, right? But they all worked to rebuild the wall. Now, some of the people rebuilt the gates. The gates are important because it's not just simple stonemasonry, right? They had to have the timbers to support the arch. They had to have the timbers to provide the doors. They had to build hinges, right? All of that stuff would have been destroyed, right? And it's a very critical juncture point, right? People come in and go out through the wall at the gates. So they're very critical infrastructure. Some people rebuilt just a section of the wall, right? And some people rebuilt gates and also worked on the wall. So they had multiple talents. Some people worked on smaller sections of the wall. Some people worked on larger sections of the wall. Now, when Nehemiah talks about the sections, he's very specific here. He wants to tell us that there's one group that helped another group to repair a gate. And then that second group that came in to help, they went on to repair 1,500 feet of the wall by themselves. Think about that. That's a lot. That's 5 football fields worth of wall for one group to repair. And we're not talking, a little wall in your garden, right? This is a fortress wall. Nehemiah also goes on, and he specifically mentions a group from one area of Israel, Tekoa, okay? And he says that the people of Tekoa worked really hard to rebuild their section of the wall, but their nobles, the people who were the nobility in their region, they refused to do any work on the wall. And not only did they refuse to do any work on the wall, they refused to listen to the people who were in charge of directing the work. Right? They were just set in their ways. They didn't want to do anything that wasn't what they wanted to do. Right? Nehemiah tells us that priests worked on the wall and Levites worked on the wall. Now, those are not people who would be stonemasons, right? Right? And the Levites, especially, a lot of them are the musicians, right? Your hands are very important if you're a musician, right? Getting your hand crushed between some stones while you're building a wall doesn't sound like a good thing for someone who's a professional musician, right? But they helped. Then he goes on and he says specifically that there were 2 goldsmiths who helped to rebuild the wall. Completely different set of skills there, right? And there was a perfumer, someone whose job it was to make perfume, helped to rebuild a section of the wall. He's specific here for a reason, right? He's telling us that it didn't matter what skill set those people had in their regular day-to-day life. They had a way to help out to rebuild the wall and to protect the people. Some people repaired the parts of the wall across from their houses. Some people repaired the parts of the wall in front of their houses. Some people repaired the part of the wall next to their houses, right? That hits really close to home. If you look out your front door and there's no wall and all you can see is enemy raiders coming in, it's a little scary, right? But all they needed to do was take care of that section in front of their house. The people next to them would take care of that section in front of their house. some people didn't repair just that one section. Some people went above and beyond. Some of them repaired more than one area. Some of them repaired 2s or 3s or 4s. Well, it's 5, but they repaired more than just one area. They weren't done, right? And he goes back, and that group from Tekoa that he mentions them again at the end here. These guys must have really impressed him. Because he said that after they repaired the section that they were assigned, they went on and they repaired a second section. And I can imagine, while they're repairing that second section, the people who were in charge of their hometown are still back there grumbling and complaining and moaning because they don't want to listen to the guys who are directing the people to do the construction, right? And lest you think this was a guys-only thing, he specifically mentions one guy who built a section of the wall with the help of his daughters, right? So everybody was in this. Doesn't matter who it was, right? And that pretty much is a summary of book 3, right? He knows what's going on, and he's telling us, although it looks like just a bunch of lists, he's giving us insight into how wide the support and the help was, right? And then in book 4, they're still building the wall. He's told us, history was a little bit, timelines were a little bit different in written Hebrew. Sometimes you talk about things in the past when you were in the future part of the book. So he goes on in book 4, and he's still continuing talking about building the wall. And he says that Sanballat, that first enemy, he's back again. And he's still ridiculing the Jewish people, right? And he asks some buddy of his in the army of Samaria, they're standing outside the walls and they're taunting the Jewish people. And he says, what do you think they're doing, rebuilding the walls of this city? And then his buddy Tobiah jumps in, and then his buddy Tobiah thinks he's going to, get his shot in. And he says, they're doing such a poor job of rebuilding the wall that if a fox runs across it, it's going to fall over, right? But Nehemiah ignores them, and he prays. He prays to God and asks God to bring guilt on his enemies because they're taunting his people, right? But the people keep going. They keep rebuilding. They keep working at it, and at this point, they've managed to rebuild the wall up to half its original height, which is a pretty good feat in itself, right? But now those 3 guys, they have some company. So they have the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites. They start coming in and taunting the Israelites as well, because they've heard how well the repairs are going. And this is a threat to them because they have taken over the land that's protected by this city, right? So they plot an attack. They're going to come in and they're going to attack the Jewish people while they are rebuilding the wall. But Nehemiah, he's got God on his side. So he prays, and they decide to set up a guard. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, while they're doing construction, there's a guard to keep watch to make sure the enemies don't come and attack, right? Now, about this time, the people are starting to get a little bit grumpy, right? Because it's a lot of work. If you've ever been out in your garden trying to lift stones out of the ground, it's hard. Your back starts to hurt. You get not so happy. Maybe your temper gets a little bit short. And the workers start complaining because, as I said in the beginning, all the stones for the wall and the temple were just scattered everywhere. So they're having to walk and step over stones, carrying stones to get things to the wall to do their work, right? And the people in the outlying towns outside of Jerusalem, they're hearing these rumors from the other people that live around them, and they're also sending in warnings that these outside people are planning to attack. So what Nehemiah does is he prays again and he reorganizes things. So what he does is he places people in strategic locations around the wall. Any place where the wall is lower, where it's vulnerable, he places a guard there, right? Those guys are armed, of course, right? Then he urges the nobles, the officials, and everyone else not to be afraid, to remember God, and to fight to protect their kin, their families, and their homes, right? They're all in this together, is his message to them. So their enemies see that the stance of the people in Jerusalem has changed, right? So they decide to call off their attack. But Nehemiah doesn't let his guard down. So from that point on, half of the workers hold weapons and guard the site, while the other half do the work of rebuilding the wall. All right, so they have a heavy guard at all times. There are workers whose job it is to just carry supplies back and forth to the wall to help the builders, right? Those workers are working with one hand and carrying a sword in their right hand at all times. So they are on guard even inside the city and outside the city where they're collecting the materials. The builders, on the other hand, they're working with both hands, but they have a sword strapped to their sides. So if somebody attacks, all they need to do is drop a stone, pick up their weapon, and they're ready to defend. And Nehemiah tells the nobles, who also have, their own security forces, to come to the aid of the workers if they hear a trumpet sound. Right? That's their alarm sound. Because they're kind of spread out, right? The wall goes the whole way around the city. Imagine rebuilding a wall around Bethlehem. We'd be pretty spread out, right? Even if we had a wall around this block, we'd be spread out with this number of people. Right? And so also Nehemiah tells everybody that they need to stop sleeping outside of the city. They need to start sleeping inside the city at night so that they're not vulnerable to attack, and if there is an attack, they can all band together and repel the attack. Right? So he goes on at the very end of this chapter, at the very end of book 4, he says that neither he, nor his brothers, nor his servants, nor men of the guard, during this time they're doing the rebuilding and they're on guard, none of them stop to wash, none of them stop to change clothes, right? And they keep their weapons on them at all times, right? So they are that prepared. They may not have smelled very good, but they were that prepared. So book 5, he goes on and tells him that now the people are starting to get worn down. They're coming to him with all kinds of different complaints, right? So the common people are having trouble getting food, right? Because the people around them don't want to sell them food. They don't want to give them food. They don't have their farms back yet. So they're having a rough time feeding themselves. And he hears that they're being forced to borrow money from the nobles of their areas just to get enough food to eat. And they're having to borrow money to pay their taxes back to the king. So their own people are taking advantage of them, right? They're forcing them to rent out their sons and daughters in some cases as servants and slaves in order to get money to eat so they can keep working and so they can pay their taxes. So Nehemiah, of course, is not pleased about this. He gets very angry. So he accuses the nobles and the officials who are doing this of preying on their own people, charging them excessive interest and basically selling themselves back into exile and slavery, right? Because they're taking advantage of their own people. And the nobles realize they have no counter argument, right? So Nehemiah tells them that they should give back all of the property that they have taken as collateral for the loans. They should give back all of the interest they have collected from these people, right? And he makes them promise that they're going to follow through on this. And then he gets a little dramatic, right? So Nehemiah then shakes out the folds of his garment, right? He didn't wear pants, right? Everybody wore a robe-like thing, right? So he shakes out the folds of his garments, and then he tells the nobles and the officials that anyone who fails to follow through with their promise will be shaken out from the fold of the house of Israel. Which is some pretty serious stuff, right? They would be removed from the community. So fortunately, nobody has to be removed. They all agree and follow through on their promises, right? And Nehemiah goes on to explain that as the governor serving the king, he is entitled to a special food allowance from the governor. He didn't take it. He supported himself. tells them that he's not devoting his attention to the land that he could acquire through that, like these guys were. He was devoting his attention to rebuilding the wall. Then he goes on, and he goes through a list of the number of people who ate his food. And remember, this food wasn't provided for him. He was paying for this out of his own pocket. So he goes through a list of the people who ate the food he provided and how much they ate on a typical day. So he knew, you went back for thirds. You had 2 extra desserts. And he knew how much wine they had over every 10-day period. So he was paying attention and calling them out on their own hypocrisy. Then we move into book 6, which is the last one I'm going to summarize for everybody here. So in book 6, those two bad guys, the 2 enemies, Sanballat and Tobiah, they've got another guy with them now, Geshem, right? And now they hear that the wall is near completion. So they say, hey, Nehemiah, let's have a meeting. We want to talk with you. So he's no fool, right? He knows that they're planning harm to him. So he says, no way. I'm not going to meet with you guys. I know something bad is going to happen. But basically, his focus is on the wall at this point. He wants it done. They ask him 4 times in total, right? And each time he answers the same way. No, I'm busy. I'm working on the wall. That's my priority. Don't have time to meet with you guys. On the 5th time, they change things up. They try to compromise his position as the leader. That happens, right? Somebody's in charge of something. Sometimes there's somebody that wants to compromise your position. So what they do is they write a letter. Now to us, that sounds okay, right? Right? But we have a modern postal service. You can go across the street, stick a stamp on your letter, put it in the box, and you know it's going to get there. Right? You know somebody's going to get in trouble if they mess with your letter between the post office and its destination. Right? But back then, there was no postal service. If you wanted to get a letter to somebody, you gave it to somebody, who gave it to somebody, who gave it to somebody. Usually some kind of a regional official, right? Because nobody sent letters unless it was official communication. So this letter had to pass through who knows how many hands to get to Nehemiah, right? So what these guys did back then was they would seal the letter. Right? If you've ever seen any movies about, knights and kings or even, stuff from the 1800s, when they would seal a letter, they had special wax that they would put on the opening of the letter, and they had a stamp that would go in there. So it was a tamper, you have the tamper evident stickers on things now, where if you pull it off, it says void, or something like that. It was that sort of thing, right? So you could guarantee that nobody looked at the contents of the letter before it got to its intended recipient. If the seal was broken, you knew something was wrong. So what did these 3 guys do? They send a letter off, but they didn't seal the letter, right? They did that on purpose because they knew that every hand that touched that letter on the way was going to read it, right? So the gossip would get around to everybody. And basically, in the letter, they made a lot of unsubstantiated claims, right? They said that Nehemiah was intending to rebel against the king and against the Persian Empire. They said that he wanted to install himself as king of Israel. And it said that the prophets all supported him in his plan to take over the country. But he knew that's not true, right? He knows that they're just intending that stuff to intimidate and scare him, and to try to get gossip to go back to the king that says he's doing stuff counter to what he told the king he was going to do. But he knows this is just to scare him off from rebuilding the wall. So he still declines to meet with them. He knows what's up, right? So he goes to visit a prophet. And the prophet's name, I'm going to probably not pronounce this right, is Shemaiah. He goes to visit Shemaiah. Now Shemaiah, unbeknownst to Nehemiah, is on those guys' side, the bad guys, right? So Shemaiah tells Nehemiah that he should go and hide in the temple because there are some men who are coming to kill him. Probably, he's telling him they're men from the king because of all the rumors that are going around, right? But Nehemiah is no dummy, right? He has a good relationship with God. He knows the law as well. And he knows that Shemaiah is lying. He's giving him a false prophecy. Because regular people aren't allowed in the temple, right? He's trying to get Nehemiah to break the law so that they have a reason to do something to him, right? He knows better. But he perseveres. And at the end of this, the wall is finished. How long do you think it took them to rebuild this wall? Any guesses? Years? 52 days. So all of this drama, all of this stuff that's happening in the background, all of that took place over 2 months, a little less. Now imagine that. How many people had to be lifting stones and working on little sections of the wall over 52 days to get the whole city walled in that amount of time? And how much plotting and how much subversion was going on over that time, over that period of time, on the part of the enemies of these guys, right? So all the nations that had taken over the lands of the Israelites around Jerusalem, these guys are all shocked now, right? Because they figured, like you guys did, it's going to take them years, if not decades, to rebuild this wall. And boop, 52 days later, the wall's done. So now they know that the God of Israel is with them. They know that they're in trouble. Because once they're done with the wall, guess what's next on the list? Taking back all the lands that the people lost, right? And they also understand how much God supports the Israelites, right? He's just given them evidence, right? They've gone from completely undefended to completely defended and fortified in 52 days, right? Now, the question is going to come up, why this story? Well, again, like I said, I was praying about this all week last week while we were here, while we were serving the kids. And I think what the Lord was trying to tell me is that this story about the wall is a metaphor for ministry. It's a metaphor for furthering the kingdom of God. Okay? And the lessons we learn from this, I've got 8 of them here. The lessons we learn from this, I think, are going to be impactful for us. So the first one is, when God gives you insight, you have to act decisively, right? Nehemiah got that insight from God and from his brother about the situation in Jerusalem. What did he do? He prayed, he fasted, and he talked to the guy in charge. He talked to the king, right? You have to act decisively. He didn't go and, talk with his buddies around the well, the water cooler, about what the problems were. He talked to the guy in charge. He talked to the king, and he acted. The second thing he did, or the second thing we can get from this is, number 2, the scope of the work will seem intimidating, right? There is so much stuff that has to be done, right? What do you think his reaction was the first night he went out to look at the wall? There's nothing there. There's just piles of rocks everywhere, right? There's no place for the people to live. There's nothing. So the scope, when you first step out, that scope is going to seem intimidating. It doesn't matter what it is. If you're reaching out to families, if you're reaching out to kids, if you're reaching out to older people, if you're reaching out to singles, you're not going to know where to start, right? It's going to seem intimidating, but that should not deter you. That should not discourage you. It's going to seem intimidating, but that brings up the third point. The third point is that you need to survey first, right? When Nehemiah got to Jerusalem, he settled in for 3 days, and then he went out on a survey. He looked to see where the weak points were for the construction, where the strong points were the construction, where work needed to be done. He did a survey. We need to when we start to do ministry, we start to do work for the kingdom, we need to do a survey and find out what needs to be done. Number 4, not everyone can do everything. One person can't rebuild it, right? Nehemiah could not rebuild that wall on his own, right? Even Noah had help building the ark, right? How long did it take him to build the ark? And he had his family helping, right? There's no way that Nehemiah would have been able to rebuild the wall on his own. One person can't do it. But that brings up point number 5. Point number 5 is everybody can do something, right? Everybody helped out on that wall. Some people did a little section. Some groups did, like you said, 5 football fields worth of wall. So everybody can do something. Number 6, some people can do more than one thing, right? He had people who made perfume laying rocks to build a wall, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're phenomenal at. It doesn't have to be something that, you can do better than anybody else, but it's something you can do. And you can do more than one thing, right? You don't have to take a 1,500-foot section of the wall, right? You can open the door. You can be a greeter and open the door to people who are coming in on a Sunday. And, you can carry the coffee pot over. That's 2 things. Those aren't hard, right? Right? Or, you could be doing something like PG or the elders that is hard, right? But they can do that too, right? So just because it looks difficult, if you break it up, it doesn't always have to be hard. Number 7, some people can do more than others, but everyone can contribute, right? Back to that 1,500-foot section of wall, right? That guy and his 2 daughters, I don't think they would have been able to rebuild 1,500 feet of wall. I think the group that did that was pretty large, right? But they were able to take probably the section of the wall nearest their house and rebuild that, right? Everybody can contribute. Just like here, we have the middle schoolers, right? These guys are such a help, right? They help out with the nursery. They help out with assisting in Kids Zone. There were so many of them here last week helping out with the Kids Zone kids. And they were so willing. It was amazing, right? Everybody can contribute. Number 8's a hard one. There's always going to be an enemy or 3. And sometimes, like that prophet that tried to take Nehemiah off track, sometimes they can be somebody who's internal, somebody who's a friend, right? They may not even know that they're knocking you off track, right? It may not be deliberate on their part either. But how did Nehemiah get around that? He knew what was what. He knew the law. He knew the word. He knew what God wanted him to do. And he knew that what somebody was telling him to do was not what God wanted him to do. So I'm sure if we dig a bit deeper, there's probably a few more here, but these are the ones that struck me. And you'll notice that a lot of these come from Nehemiah 3. That's why I stressed in the beginning that if you're going to read it, make sure you pay special attention. Not if, when. When you read it, make sure you pay special attention to chapter 3, right? Because at first glance, it's one of those where you just zone out and you read the words, but they don't sink in. But read it and let it sink in, because Nehemiah has so much insight there about leadership, about delegation, and I think all of that is applicable to what we're doing here, what we're trying to do here. Now, some of us need to work on some of this. Right? Some of us need to know that we can step out and we can help out. We can do things in ministry here. We can do things in ministry even if it's just talking to the kids when you walk, to the other kids at the bus stop when you walk your kids to the bus, right? You can do little things for ministry everywhere and every day. Some of us may not have been doing that. So I have something I would like us to do. It's a little bit prophetic, I guess, and this is something new for me, but what I have here is, it's a little wall, okay? I want us, as a prophetic act, if you feel like you've not been helping to build that wall in ministry or in the kingdom, I have the opportunity here for you to come up and take a brick and put it in the wall as a symbolic representation of you signing yourself up to be one of the builders of the kingdom. If you're already a builder, you're welcome to come up and put a brick on there too. Please just don't take more than one brick. I don't think I have enough. But put a brick there as a symbolic act that you are helping to build the kingdom, or you now want to step forward and start helping to build the kingdom.